Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, have you ever wondered how two graphics cards stack up against each other simply because they have similar names? Probably not. Have you ever wanted to watch a benchmark video of such a thing? Please see my previous answer. That said, I noticed that I currently have an Nvidia GeForce GTX 570 and AMD Radeon RX 570, and despite 6.5 years and many technical differences between them, I really wanted to see how they compared. Nvidia's Fermi 2.0 based GTX 570, launched in late 2010, features 1.28GB of GDDR5 and requires two 6-pin connectors. It has a 219 watt TDP and cost $349 at launch. Game ready driver support ended in March 2018 with version 391.35. AMD's Radeon RX 570 launched in 2017 with 4 and 8GB models available. I'm using the cheaper 4GB card today, which cost $169 when new. It has a 150 watt TDP and my Sapphire version requires a single 8-pin connector. The latest driver at the time of upload dates back to January 2026, though it no longer receives regular Adrenalin drivers like newer AMD cards do. I know which card my money is on, but after testing the GTX 570 in SLI the other day, I was pretty surprised by its performance. Sure, it lacks modern DX12 support, meaning a lot of games won't run at all, but those that did offered better than expected frame rates, at least I thought so. But just how big is the gap? Is there a huge difference between Nvidia's old GTX 570 and AMD's less old RX 570? Let's find out. To better accommodate the 1.28GB GTX 570, I have made some sacrifices to the visuals in certain games that may not be necessary with the RX 570. But in the interest of fairness, I had to use the same settings, and I needed to use settings that the GTX card could handle. Arc Raiders is one such example of this, quite an extreme example. Now I had to drop this down to 25% resolution with the lowest settings, and even so the GTX 570 here couldn't really handle double digits. We were looking at 8 frames per second overall, with a 1% low of 4 and a 0.1% low of 4, so pretty consistent numbers if I do say so. That said, it was consistently terrible, and you can't really get away with playing like this, but as I said, I'm just surprised it started. Anyway, the RX 570 on the other hand managed to hit 137 FPS, though you certainly aren't going to be playing at settings like this because this card can handle higher visual options with native resolution as well. But for comparison's sake, well, there we go. Quite the difference in performance for this opening title. For Counter-Strike 2, both 570 cards actually produced pretty decent results, especially when you consider the age of Nvidia's GTX card. We were looking at 90 frames per second here with a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 48, so the average was actually pretty good. And not only that, but it was quite a smooth gameplay experience as well, considering the amount of VRAM. I've paired this card with an i5-12400F, and I'm actually using Windows 11, which did work just fine using the latest old Nvidia drivers. The only problem, of course, is that we were limited to 60Hz. Now I have a 144Hz monitor, and we couldn't really utilize that. We could enable 120Hz mode, but then the game or the whole sort of desktop would default to like a really low resolution. So unfortunately we were limited to 60, but that's not too much of a concern. Here, I'm just glad it worked. Now, by comparison, the RX 570, using the same lowest settings, offered a very nice 215 frames per second overall here. And it's great that we can achieve it on this now lower cost GPU in 2026. 215 with a 1% low of 152 and a 0.1% low of 94. Very smooth. For Grand Theft Auto 5 Legacy Edition, or the original version of the game at 1080p with normal settings and the detail sliders set to max with FXAA, the GTX 570 managed a very respectable 111 frames per second. This is along with very smooth percentile lows of 87 and 81, so very consistent here. When we move over to the 570, this of course produced a better average, about 40 frames per second more, so not a huge gap, not the biggest gap we've seen today, that's for sure, but there will be a few more issues with this card when we encroach on the FPS limit. I think this game is capped at like 180 something FPS, and when we get close to that we'll get some pretty massive stutters, but I managed to capture these performance figures from a brief run that didn't exhibit any of these problems, but you may notice in the footage here that there will be a few pretty big dips and drops, so higher settings would alleviate this, or a frame rate cap. When you turn the settings up with a 570, something it's more than capable of, these drops should go away because we won't be anywhere near the FPS limit for the game. Battlefield 1, one of my all-time favourites now, at 1080p with the low preset for 54 FPS on the 570, a very good result. The 1% low was 46 and the 0.1% low was 44, so again, it was very smooth and very consistent during this single player level here. I still think it looks pretty good at low, and it's ideal if you have slightly older systems because it's still a fun one to play, and as we can see here, it still runs quite well too. The RX 570 hit 191 FPS. The game is capped at 200 by default here from the settings menu, and there will certainly be a lot of moments where we hit that, but overall the average was slightly lower. The 1% low was 165 and the 0.1% low was 41. So this was actually worse than the GTX 570, which is quite surprising, but there will be a couple of dips and drops with this hardware. As expected though, the RX card did come out on top. I'm running Fortnite in Legacy Performance mode. This uses DX11 instead of DX12. I also have the view distance set to far, the textures and meshes set to high. And with the GTX 570, surprisingly, it's another good result, 98 FPS. This isn't bad performance by any means, and I could happily play on this GTX card, albeit with performance mode enabled, as you can see here. The percentile lows weren't bad either. 65 and 42 meant that a lot of the time this was very consistent and very playable. When we compare that to the RX footage, 270 FPS was the average, so we could certainly do with higher settings here, but as I said, for the sake of comparison, we do need to retain the same visual settings for both. 270 was the average, 126 was the 1% low, and the 0.1% low was 51, so not that much higher than what we saw on the GTX card. But yes, as expected, the 6.5 year newer RX card does pull ahead, but that I think was always a given from the start. Not sure what the point exactly of this comparison was, but I noticed I had two cards, both called 570, and that was it. I felt like I needed to make a comparison. Perhaps the most pointless graphics card comparison thus far on YouTube, but there we go. We'll finalise with one of my favourites, another one, Mafia Definitive Edition. Love this remake of the original game, but I also really enjoy the original one too, and that is of course much better for older hardware. The GTX 570 with the lowest settings runs this at 22 FPS, a 1% low of 11 and a 0.1% low of 8.1. Not really playable at 1080p here, but you can get away with it in certain areas. There will be spikes towards 30 FPS. When we look at the 570, that will hit 74 overall, a 1% low of 61 and a 0.1% low of 51. I should clarify that's the RX 570. I think I might have accidentally just said 570 again, but that doesn't help when both cards share the same name. But there we are. If you ever wondered which 570 was better, the GTX or the RX, you probably didn't, but I hope this clears things up. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one when we will hopefully be reviving an old Alienware desktop.